In the last video, we talked about how an action potential is generated at the trigger zone of a neuron. In this video, we're going to go ahead and look at how that action potential is then conducted down along the length of the axon, all the way to those synaptic knobs at the very end of the telodendria. But first, let's go ahead and quickly review what happens with an action potential. First of all, I just want to remind you that at rest, the resting membrane potential is approximately -70. And you know that to get an action potential, we actually have to alter the permeability of the membrane to the ions sodium and potassium. The way that we alter membrane permeability is through opening up of voltage-gated sodium and voltage-gated potassium channels. When the neuron is at rest, those channels are closed, and so we only have a small movement of potassium and sodium across the cell membrane. Well, something happens to cause an EPSP, an excitatory postsynaptic potential, and that will open up some of the voltage-gated sodium channels. And so you can see once the activation gate opens up, sodium is going to move across and start to depolarize the cell membrane. If the EPSP is big enough to get to threshold, which is typically approximately -15 millivolts, then we're going to get into a positive feedback loop, which essentially will open up all of the voltage-gated sodium channels. And we open up more and more of them as more sodium comes in. That causes a very, very rapid movement of sodium from outside the cell to the inside of the cell as it moves down its electrochemical gradient. The inside the cell is negative, sodium is positive, and so it's electrically attracted as well as moving from high concentration to low concentration. And you know that there's a very high concentration of sodium outside of the cell. At some point, the inactivation gate on those voltage-gated sodium channels is going to close. And so that prevents any further entry of sodium into the cell, and the depolarization stops at approximately +30 millivolts. At roughly the same time, the voltage-gated potassium channels have opened up, and now potassium is going to go down its electrochemical gradient. And so remember, right now the inside of the cell is positive, even though typically it's negative. And since positive charge repels, the positively charged sodium is going to be pushed out of these voltage-gated sodium channels, as well as moving down its concentration gradient. And this drives the membrane potential from +30 down below 0, all the way past the resting membrane potential. These voltage-gated potassium channels don't get closed quite quickly enough, and so we actually experience this brief period of hyperpolarization where the membrane goes to approximately -80. Once all the gates are closed, the sodium-potassium pumps will quickly move sodium out of the cell and potassium back into the cell, and you can see that as that occurs, we return to a resting membrane potential of approximately -70. Okay, good. And here we are. We can see that the inactivation gates of the voltage-gated sodium channels are closed, and the sodium channels are still open. All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit about what we mean by all or none in terms of the action potential. And here you can see that if we don't reach threshold, in this particular neuron, threshold is relatively small. It's only -5 millivolts, where typically it's -15. Here we have a fairly small EPSP, which causes a slight depolarization that isn't close to threshold. And so very quickly, the sodium-potassium pumps will return the membrane potential back to its rest, or -70. Here you can see that EPSPs can be additive, but in this case we still haven't reached threshold. We've only depolarized to about -66 or -67, and so we still don't get an action potential. We're in the none part of it. If we do in fact reach threshold, here we have 3 EPSPs that have added together to get us up to and even past threshold. We get a full-blown action potential. Again, at threshold, we're going to open up pretty much all of the voltage-gated sodium channels. And so regardless of how strong the EPSPs are, we can't open up any more than all of the voltage-gated sodium channels. And so each action potential is approximately the same magnitude. That's what we mean by all or none. We either get a complete action potential or we don't get any at all. No threshold, no action potential. Threshold, we just get a full and complete action potential. So a question might be, if all the action potentials are the same size, how in the world do we know when one stimulus is stronger than another stimulus? How do we know one light's brighter than another light? How do we know one pain hurts more than another pain? And the answer is that the intensity of the stimulus is coded in action potential frequency, not size. Here we can see what happens when we change the pressure that is experienced by a receptor. And when the pressure is very, very light, you can see that we only get a few action potentials, not that many. And each of these is an action potential, but it's happening so quickly that it just looks like it's a single vertical line. We increase the pressure and we get more action potentials. We increase the pressure further, we get even more action potentials. And so you can see that the number of action potentials continues to go up as the strength of the stimulus goes up. And so that's how we code intensity of the stimulus. It's coded in frequency as opposed to magnitude of action potential. And here you can see again that if the stimulus doesn't reach threshold, we get no action potentials. If the stimulus reaches threshold, we get action potentials, but a stronger stimulus doesn't result in action potentials that are depolarized to a level higher than plus 30. It just results in more action potentials in a given amount of time. The other thing that we need to talk about is refractory periods. And so when we get an action potential, we have these refractory periods that occur. The absolute refractory period is a period of time where no matter what we do, we cannot get a second action potential. We just have to sit and wait. And initially, for the depolarization phase of this, once we reach threshold, we open up all the voltage-gated sodium channels. We can't open up any more than all of them, and so while they're open, we're just going to get this one action potential and nothing else can happen. Once we reach plus 30 millivolts, the inactivation gate shuts and nothing we can do will open up the inactivation gate other than just simply waiting. And so we can't superimpose a second action potential here. Again, this is known as the absolute refractory period. At some point when the inactivation gate opens up, and the activation gate of the voltage-gated sodium channel is closed, we get into what's called a relative refractory period. The truth is that we could get a second action potential at 1.2 milliseconds. It's just that now it would require a stronger stimulus than typical. And that will open up voltage-gated sodium channels. You can see as we get into the hyperpolarization phase, we're further away from the threshold than we were before. And so if threshold was negative 15 millivolts before, now it's negative 25 millivolts. And so again, it requires a stronger stimulus than it did. You can also see that the relative refractory period will last as long as the hyperpolarization lasts. We don't get out of relative refractory period until we've returned to the resting membrane potential of negative 70. And so we do have these refractory periods. All right, now we've already actually talked about this, but we'll review real quickly. If the membrane potential does not reach threshold, then it just very quickly is returned to the resting membrane potential. And the thing that does that would be the sodium-potassium pumps. They pump the extra sodium back out of the cell and any extra potassium back in so that we get back to negative 70. And now we're ready to go on to look at conduction. And so we've generated our action potential here at the trigger zone of the neuron. And so here you can see that. That piece of membrane is depolarized. Sodium has come in and it's made it positive inside as opposed to negative inside, which is typically the case. But when you look at this segment of axon, you can see that the charges are lined up so that we go positive to negative, then negative to positive, positive back to negative, and negative back to positive. And what we get here is now we have a flow of current. Anytime we have charges like this, we get flow of current. And flow of currents through this piece of membrane is actually going to open up the voltage-gated sodium channels here. That allows sodium to come in, and we depolarize this adjacent piece of membrane. And now, as you can see, we're going to get flow of current here through this segment. And again, that flow of current is going to open up voltage-gated sodium channels here. That will allow sodium to come in, and we will depolarize this piece. Even though they don't show it to you here, we'll get flow of current through these two segments of axon, and so on and so on and so on, until we get all the way down here to the synaptic knobs. And so you can see that we don't have one action potential that somehow moves along the surface of the membrane. Instead, one action potential creates a second, creates a third, creates a fourth, fifth, sixth, and so on, until eventually we've moved all the way down to the end of the axon. Some people have made the analogy that this is a little bit like the wave at a football stadium or a baseball stadium, where one group of people stands up and then they quickly sit down, and as they are sitting, the group of people next to them is standing up. And if you're on the far side of the stadium, you almost get the impression that there is movement there. Another question that you might have is, well, isn't there also flow of current here? And the answer to that is, yes, there is. And so then you might also ask, well, won't that open up the voltage-gated sodium channels here in this piece of membrane? The answer is no, it won't. And so I want you to think about that and see if you can tell me why it won't. Pause the video now and see if you can do that. If you said that it won't open up voltage-gated sodium channels here because this piece of membrane is in the absolute refractory period, then you are right. And that's what will happen and what will prevent an action potential from occurring here. This is looking at the same thing that we just talked about, but just in a slightly different way. Here what we've done is we've put voltmeters along the membrane so that we can see what's happening. Here is the initial segment where the action potential is first generated. And again, you can see that it's depolarized. Sodium has come in and made it positive, and as a result, we're going to get flow of current through here. And it's that flow of current which is going to stimulate the voltage-gated sodium channels here and open them up and allow positively charged sodium to begin to enter the cell and depolarize it. And you can see we've gone from -70 to -60. If the stimulus was strong enough to get an action potential here, it will cause an action potential here. And then so on down the entire length of the axon, as we've already talked about. And so again, you might pause the video and review that. We'll also see that we get flow of current here. So positive to positive, and so on. And we get flow of current. That's going to open up voltage-gated sodium channels here. And now what we'll do is we'll look at what happens when we add myelin to the covering of the axon. And again, remember that myelin doesn't cover the entire axon. We have these bare spots. Anybody remember what those bare spots are called? And again, you might pause it and see if you can remember. These are nodes, nodes of Ranvier where there is no myelin. But at any rate, here you can see this piece of membrane at the node is depolarized. Sodium has entered the cell and caused it to depolarize. We have flow of current that can move along the length of the axon until it gets to the next node. And then it's going to move through and come back around again. There's our flow of current. And that flow of current will open up voltage-gated sodium channels here at the node. And so not surprisingly, when we look at the membrane, we don't find many voltage-gated sodium channels here underneath the myelin, but we find more voltage-gated sodium channels and more voltage-gated potassium channels here at the node of Ranvier. And so that lets us create fewer action potentials to get from the trigger zone down to the synaptic buttons. And that means rather than requiring an action potential here and then 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 to get from node to node, we only need 2, one here and one here. And so the action potentials will move along far faster. How long does it take? What is the speed at which action potentials move along an myelinated axon compared to an unmyelinated axon? And you might pause the video and see if you can remember. And the answer is that an action potential can be conducted at about 200 miles per hour down a myelinated axon, where in an unmyelinated axon it only goes at about 2 miles per hour. This is referred to as saltatory conduction because to the electrophysiologist who first witnessed this, it looked as if the action potential jumped from node to node. And so that's what it looked like was occurring. And again, here you can see the same thing, but now we're using our voltmeters again. At this node, we've depolarized it. Sodium has entered, but we will get flow of current from this node to the next node. We can't have flow of current all the way from here down to the second node because that current actually dies off before it can reach that second node. But once this node depolarizes, then again we set up flow of current there and we get another action potential at that point. And so there you can see the way that conduction occurs. And this will occur without decrement of the action potentials at every single node until we reach the ends of the telodendria or the synaptic knobs. And so now we need to go ahead and we need to get that signal from one neuron to the next neuron or from one neuron to an effector cell. And the way we do that is through synapses. And most of you are familiar with the idea that synapses are between an axon of one neuron and a dendrite of another neuron, which is what you see here. And this is historically and quantitatively the most important of synapses. But as you can see, you could have a synapse between two axons, axo-axonic. You could have a synapse between two dendrites, which is a little bit more unusual, or you could have a synapse between an axon and the cell body of a second neuron, axosomatic. And here you can see a photomicrograph of the axon of a couple of neurons synapsing with a postsynaptic neuron. And so over here, this is the postsynaptic neuron, and here are two presynaptic axons that are coming in and creating, you can see that these are axosomatic, and so between the axon and the cell body. And that brings us to the end of this video, and in the next video we will talk about how these synapses work. We'll see that there are actually two types of synapse, an electrotonic synapse and a chemical synapse. And so now you can go ahead and watch the next video.